Welcome to True Echo, where forgotten voices are heard, hidden truths are revealed, and incredible real-life stories echo in your heart long after the video ends. Today's story will leave you speechless, inspired, and moved. Let's dive in. Veilwood was a place where the ocean mist curled down crooked cobblestone streets and the houses leaned into the wind as if whispering old secrets. Most mornings you could walk those narrow lanes and hear nothing but the distant cry of gulls. But lately something, or rather someone, had started stirring the town before dawn. It began with rumors. A child, no more than 8 years old, walking 6 massive German shepherds through the swirling fog without a single leash. Some said it was a ghost. Others, a miracle. But every morning at 6:30 a.m., those rumors became flesh and blood as Charlotte Hayes appeared, her teal jacket zipped to her chin, her tiny hand barely flicking as 6 immense dogs glided around her in perfect formation. They didn't bark. They didn't pull. They didn't even glance sideways. It was as if Charlotte and the dogs shared a secret language unseen by the world. Among the gathered onlookers was Margaret Glenn, retired principal and self-appointed guardian of community order. Her face, usually set in tight lines of disapproval, hardened further as she watched the small girl and her silent army. It wasn't natural, Margaret muttered under her breath. Children didn't command that kind of power. Not over beasts like those. With a shaky hand, she lifted her phone, pressing the record button. She needed evidence, she thought grimly. Evidence to present to the town council. Evidence that would stop this madness before it led to tragedy. Yet as Charlotte disappeared into the mist beyond Patterson's bakery, her dogs fanning out like disciplined soldiers, even Margaret felt a shiver not of fear, but of awe. Inside the bakery, Carmen Patterson shook her head, wiping her hands on her apron. "They don't see it," she whispered to no one. "That child isn't leading the dogs. She's surviving because of them." Far across town, at the edge of Veilwood where the last crooked fence posts gave way to thick woods, Charlotte slipped quietly into her small Cape Cod-style home. The dogs peeled off in practiced order, Vega guarding the porch, Daisy twitching restlessly, Atlas anchoring the rear. Inside, the house sagged under the weight of grief. Faded photos lined the walls. Adam and Marina Hayes, beaming with pride, holding newborn Charlotte in one hand and a wriggling shepherd pup in the other. Those golden days were gone now, swallowed up by one brutal night that shattered everything. Charlotte moved silently past her grandparents, Walter and June, who hovered like brittle statues in the kitchen. Their love was fierce but their bodies frail. They tried, but it was the dogs, her dogs, who truly understood the storm raging inside her. She fed them, brushed them, whispered to them the commands she'd memorized from her father's worn notebooks. They were not pets. They were lifelines. Each German shepherd carried a piece of her parents' love, their dream, their promise that Charlotte would never be alone. But Veilwood wasn't a place that welcomed the unusual for long. Anne Margaret Glenn had already set plans in motion that would test the fragile peace Charlotte clung to. The town of Veilwood might have seemed charming on the surface, but underneath, it crackled with whispered judgments and small fears amplified into something monstrous. By midweek, Margaret Glenn's blurry footage of Charlotte and her 6 unleashed German shepherds had made the rounds. From church basements to PTA meetings, from hardware store counters to backyard fences. "It's a disaster waiting to happen," Margaret insisted, seated at the Painted Sloop Cafe, her fingers tapping furiously against a worn coffee cup. A half-circle of anxious townspeople leaned in as she spread her petition across the table like a general plotting a siege. Names flowed onto it, some eager, some reluctant. Fear was persuasive even if it wasn't always logical. Across town, Carmen Patterson, the bakery owner, hosted her own quiet rebellion. Over sticky buns and fresh-brewed coffee, she rallied others who had watched Charlotte's walks in quiet admiration. "She's not a threat," Carmen argued. "That child is doing something extraordinary. She's holding herself together the only way she knows how." A few neighbors nodded, others shrugged. Still, the winds of Veilwood were shifting. An official complaint was lodged at Town Hall. And soon enough, a tidy letter stamped with the cold insignia of Child Protective Services arrived at the Hayes battered mailbox. Walter opened it with trembling hands while Charlotte sat cross-legged on the floor, brushing Atlas's thick coat. His heart seized painfully at the words, "scheduled welfare visit." It didn't matter how much love they gave her. To the outside world, an elderly couple raising an orphan girl with 6 enormous dogs looked like chaos waiting to happen. Charlotte sensed the tension immediately. She set aside the brush and crept closer to Walter, resting a small hand against his leg. He tried to smile but failed. "We might have to answer some questions soon, sweetheart," he said, voice rough like gravel. About the dogs. About everything. Charlotte only nodded. Words came hard lately. Especially when the fear clenched so tightly around her chest. Later that night, tucked into her small bed with Vega pressed protectively against her side, Charlotte pulled out the old, battered notebook she kept hidden beneath her pillow, her father's training journal. Page after page in his looping scrawl, "Trust is everything. Without it there's no team, only noise." She traced the words with her fingertip, as if trying to pull her parents' voices out of the faded ink. She whispered into the dark, so soft not even Vega's twitching ears caught it. "I trust you." Downstairs, Walter and June sat at the kitchen table, the letter spread between them like a wound. "What if they try to take her away?" June whispered. Walter shook his head. "We won't let that happen." But deep down they both knew, love might not be enough against the cold machinery of the state. Out on the porch, Daisy whined softly at the rising wind. Something was changing in Veilwood. And soon Charlotte would be forced to fight for the only family she had left. The welfare check came on a gray Tuesday afternoon, when the clouds hung so low they seemed stitched to the rooftops. Charlotte stood frozen at the living room window as a dull county sedan pulled into the gravel drive. Vega pressed her nose against the glass, growling low in her throat until Charlotte gave a soft hand signal, "Settle." The dog obeyed instantly, dropping into a watchful sit. Walter opened the door slowly, leaning heavier than usual on his cane. Two figures approached, a woman in a navy blazer with a clipboard tucked under one arm, and a thick-set man in an animal control uniform. "Good afternoon," the woman said with brittle politeness. "I'm Joanne Marweather from Child Protective Services. This is Officer Raymond Lake with Barnstable County Animal Control." June hovered behind Walter, wringing her hands. "Please come in." The agent stepped carefully inside, their eyes darting toward the dogs, 6 magnificent German shepherds, poised like statues, tense but obedient. Charlotte sat cross-legged on the floor among them, her hand resting lightly on Atlas's thick neck. For a moment the room was thick with silence, broken only by the ticking of the grandfather clock. Joanne offered a thin smile. "We're here because there have been concerns raised about the safety and welfare of your granddaughter." Walter's chest tightened. He hated the implication in her voice, that their home, their family, was somehow dangerous. "She's safe," he said, voice trembling. "More than safe." Joanne jotted something down. "We'll need to ask some questions." The next hour was a careful dance. Joanne asked about Charlotte's schooling, her therapy, her daily routines. June answered steadily, her voice shaking only when she explained how Charlotte barely spoke to anyone but the dog since her parents' accident. Meanwhile, Officer Lake circled the room, observing the dogs. He tested their reactions, sudden movements, dropped objects, loud claps. Each time, the shepherds remained perfectly composed, responding only to Charlotte's small, unseen cues. Finally, he knelt by Charlotte, smiling warmly. "You take very good care of them, don't you?" Charlotte, who had been silent throughout the visit, nodded shyly. Officer Lake's voice softened. "And they take care of you, huh?" Another nod. Joanne closed her notebook. "We'll file a report," she said carefully. "It seems clear that Charlotte shares a strong bond with these animals. However, we may recommend some conditions." Walter stiffened. "Conditions?" "Supervision. Limits on the number of dogs walked at one time. Possible enrollment in a formal canine training program overseen by a certified adult." Charlotte's stomach knotted. They were going to change everything, chip away at the fragile world she'd fought to keep standing. As Joanne and Officer Lake left, promising follow-ups and evaluations, Charlotte stood at the window watching them go, her small hand pressed against the cold glass. Down the street, she noticed a figure lingering, Margaret Glenn pretending to examine a lamppost but clearly watching. Charlotte turned away, pressing her forehead to Vega's warm side. She understood now. This wasn't about safety. It was about fear. About control. And somehow she was going to have to find the courage to fight back. The town meeting that sealed Charlotte's fate was held on a Thursday evening, under the old oak beams of the Veilwood Town Hall. Rain splattered against the tall windows as neighbors packed into the cramped room, their whispers weaving into a restless buzz. At the front, Mayor Angela Beck tapped her gavel. "Tonight, we address the petition concerning public safety regarding large, unleashed dogs, particularly those under the care of minors." Her voice carried the weary patience of someone accustomed to small-town squabbles. Margaret Glenn rose stiffly from her seat, clasping a folder to her chest. Her silver hair gleamed under the harsh fluorescent lights. As she approached the microphone, she caught sight of Charlotte, sitting with Walter and June near the back, Vega lying at her feet. For a flicker of a second, guilt shimmered in Margaret's eyes, but she blinked it away. "We all know and care for Charlotte Hayes," Margaret began, her voice shaking with practiced emotion. "But no matter how special this bond may seem, 6 powerful dogs under the control of an 8-year-old is a tragedy waiting to happen." Low murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. Charlotte clenched her fists in her lap, feeling Vega's steady heartbeat against her ankle. Margaret held up her phone, playing the grainy video footage of Charlotte walking the dogs through the morning mist. "This is what we're dealing with. No leashes. No adults. Just a child and 6 animals capable of overwhelming any adult if they so chose." Mayor Beck raised a hand. "Mrs. Glenn, please stick to the facts." Margaret nodded, her mouth tight. "The facts are simple. Accidents happen. Dogs, no matter how well trained, are unpredictable. I urge the council to pass an ordinance limiting the number of large dogs any individual under the age of 16 may control at one time." A few heads nodded. Others frowned. Carmen Patterson, the bakery owner, stood up suddenly, her voice cutting through the rising tension. "I've watched that little girl and her dogs every morning," Carmen said, voice trembling. "They're the most disciplined beings in this town. Better behaved than most people's kids." A ripple of laughter lightened the heavy air. Carmen pressed on. "This isn't about danger. It's about fear of what we don't understand." Other townspeople rose to echo her sentiment. Dr. Gerald Yates, the local veterinarian, spoke of the dog's impeccable health and training. Officer Neil Grant, who had responded to the alley incident, testified that he'd seen no aggression from the dogs, even under stress. Still, the fear Margaret had seeded was strong. Parents spoke tearfully about their toddlers running loose. Older residents fretted about being knocked over. Andrea Lewis, holding her cat Fluffy in a carrier, gave a shaky statement about her lingering fear, even though she admitted no harm had come. Charlotte sat silently, her throat aching with the words she couldn't force out. Her palms were slick with sweat. Vega rested her chin on Charlotte's knee, sensing the storm inside her. Finally, Mayor Beck looked out over the divided crowd. "This is clearly an emotionally charged issue. Before making a decision, I would like to hear from Charlotte Hayes herself." Walter squeezed Charlotte's hand. June whispered, "Only if you want to, sweetheart." Charlotte's heart thundered. She wanted to scream that the dogs were her family, that without them she wouldn't sleep, wouldn't smile, wouldn't even exist. But when she stood, facing the sea of expectant faces, her voice locked tight in her throat. She opened her mouth. Nothing came out. A few impatient shuffles echoed through the hall. Margaret's face hardened triumphantly. Then slowly Charlotte dropped to one knee. She gave a silent series of gestures, and Vega responded immediately. "Sit. Stay. Ill. Back. Down. Guard." The room watched in stunned silence as the German Shepherd executed each command with perfect precision, responding to Charlotte's barely perceptible movements. The demonstration lasted less than a minute, but it spoke louder than any speech Charlotte could have given. When she finally met the mayor's eyes, she saw not pity, but respect. Mayor Beck leaned forward. "Thank you, Charlotte." The council recessed for deliberation. Charlotte returned to her seat, shoulders sagging with exhaustion. Walter squeezed her hand. June wiped away a tear. Around them the townsfolk buzzed, not with anger now but with awe. Even Margaret sat rigidly, her face pale, the paper in her hands crumpling slightly. Somewhere deep inside her, the iron certainty that she was doing the right thing began to fracture. When the council returned, Mayor Beck delivered the verdict. Charlotte could keep her dogs, but new conditions would be enforced. And no more than 2 dogs walked at a time unless accompanied by an adult. A mandatory continued oversight by an animal behavior specialist. Regular CPS welfare checks to ensure Charlotte's well-being. It wasn't perfect, but it was a victory. Charlotte didn't need applause or cheers. As she buried her face in Vega's thick fur, relief flooded her small body. They would stay together. The battle had been won. But the war for trust, for belonging, in Veilwood was far from over. The days following the town meeting were both a balm and a blade. On one hand, Charlotte's victory meant she could continue her walks with her dogs, the lifelines that tethered her to hope. On the other hand, everywhere she went now, she felt the weight of watching eyes. Friendly ones, cautious ones, judgmental ones. It didn't matter. They all made her small shoulders tighten with invisible burdens. Walter and June did their best to keep life steady. They arranged for Elias Thompson, a retired K-9 handler and an old friend of Adam Hayes, to meet Charlotte twice a week. Elias was kind, patient, and spoke to the dogs, and to Charlotte, with a gentle certainty that made her feel safe. "You don't have to be loud to lead," Elias told her once, crouching beside her in the backyard as Vega demonstrated a flawless recall command. "Quiet strength carries farther than 1,000 shouts." Charlotte clung to that idea. She practiced relentlessly, refining the intricate hand signals her father had left behind. With Elias's guidance, her bond with the dogs grew even tighter. Now, when she walked two at a time or sometimes just one, it was not with hesitation but with a quiet confidence. Still, unease lingered. Margaret Glen remained a looming figure, occasionally seen hovering near the park, or walking slowly past the haze-weathered home, her face a complicated mask of guilt and something harder to name. Charlotte didn't know the full story yet. Only that Margaret seemed sadder now, smaller somehow. Then came the event that changed everything. It was a windy Saturday morning when Charlotte decided to take Ranger and Daisy down to the harbor. Walter, feeling stronger that day, offered to trail behind with June, giving Charlotte a thin shield of adult presence to satisfy the new town ordinance. The town was buzzing. Veilwood's annual spring market had opened, lining the main street with colorful booths selling everything from seashell jewelry to kettle corn. Musicians strummed guitars. Children darted between tables clutching balloons. Charlotte, hugging Ranger's leash and Daisy's harness close to her chest, edged through the crowd. She kept to the sides, skirting the busiest areas, whispering small cues to the dogs to slow, turn, or stop. At the far end of the market, an old man lost his footing on the slick cobblestones. He fell hard, knocking over a rack of pottery. The crash startled a pair of terriers on retractable leashes nearby. They bolted into the crowd, barking wildly. Chaos exploded. Stalls toppled. People screamed. Children shrieked and scrambled. One of the terriers slipped its collar entirely, dashing toward the busiest section of the fair. Without thinking, Charlotte dropped into a crouch, giving Ranger and Daisy a sharp hand signal, "Guard." The dogs froze, blocking her from the stampede. Then Charlotte whistled, sharp and clear. The dogs turned their heads instantly. With her heart hammering, Charlotte gestured toward the runaway terrier. In a fluid movement, Ranger sprinted after the panicked animal, not to attack but to herd. Within seconds, the German shepherd circled the terrier, guiding it gently away from the tables and into a safe corner against the wall of the bakery. Meanwhile, Daisy stayed glued to Charlotte's side, warding off the frightened crowd that threatened to trample them. It all happened in under a minute. But to the townspeople, it unfolded like a miracle. Officer Grant, who had been patrolling nearby, rushed to the scene just as Ranger cornered the tiny terrier. Grant scooped up the shivering dog and turned to Charlotte with something close to reverence in his eyes. "You saved that dog's life," he said. "And maybe a few people's too." Charlotte ducked her head, cheeks flaming. She hadn't done it to impress anyone. She just hadn't known how not to help. By the time Walter and June pushed through the crowd, breathless and terrified, they found Charlotte kneeling beside Daisy, calm as a stone in the aftermath of the storm. The market resumed, slower, more cautious. But the story spread like wildfire. The silent girl and her German shepherds had not been a menace. They had been heroes. That night, as the sunset painted Veilwood gold and purple, Margaret Glen sat alone at her immaculate dining table, the evening newspaper open before her. Across the front page was a photo of Charlotte, crouched beside Ranger and Daisy, one hand resting lightly on each dog's neck. The headline screamed, "Tiny Hero Tames Chaos, Veilwood's Miracle Girl and Her Dogs Save Spring Market." Margaret traced the picture with a trembling finger. Her throat burned. All the bitterness, the blame she had harbored, it crumbled. And in its place bloomed an unbearable truth. Charlotte Hayes wasn't a danger to Veilwood. She was its heart. Margaret Glen didn't sleep that night. The photo of Charlotte, tiny and determined with her two brave dogs, lay on her bedside table, illuminated only by the dim lamp. Margaret turned it over and over in her hands as guilt gnawed through her like acid. The memories she had fought to bury clawed their way to the surface. That stormy night months ago when she had been driving too fast, too tired, too careless. The blinding headlights, the screech of tires, the awful crunch of metal folding on itself. The Hayes car had veered off the road, she remembered, and she had kept driving. She hadn't stopped. She hadn't stopped. Maybe she hadn't hit them. Maybe she hadn't directly caused the crash. But deep in her bones, Margaret knew she was part of what had gone so terribly wrong. She had told herself it was better not to get involved. That confessing wouldn't change anything, only destroy her reputation, her life. So she had folded the guilt into a neat, bitter ball and shoved it somewhere deep. Until Charlotte began appearing every morning with those German shepherds, the living echoes of the life Margaret's actions had shattered. And now here she was, faced with the undeniable truth. The little girl she had tried to discredit had more courage in her smallest finger than Margaret had mustered her whole life. At sunrise, Margaret made a decision. She dressed carefully, neat navy dress, practical shoes, and drove slowly to the Hayes house, her heart hammering so loudly she could barely hear herself think. As she climbed out of her car, the old oak trees seemed to lean in judgment above her. Walter was trimming the bushes near the porch when he spotted her. His face tightened immediately. "What do you want?" he asked, wiping his hands on a rag. Margaret swallowed the lump in her throat. "I need to talk to you," she said, voice rasping. "Please." Walter hesitated. Then, perhaps sensing the desperation in her, he nodded curtly. He led her around to the small backyard where Charlotte sat cross-legged in the grass, brushing Atlas's thick coat. Daisy and Vega dozed in the sunlight nearby. At the sight of Margaret, Charlotte stiffened, one hand tightening instinctively on the dog's collar. Walter leaned on his cane and said gruffly, "Say your piece." Margaret's hands trembled. She knelt awkwardly in the grass, lowering herself to Charlotte's eye level. "I owe you the truth," she said. "All of you." She told them everything, haltingly, painfully, about the night of the crash. About her panic. Her silence. Her cowardice. Charlotte sat very still, her face blank, but her eyes, those wide, wounded eyes, shimmered with unshed tears. Walter's jaw worked silently. June had come out too, gripping the back of a lawn chair so hard her knuckles whitened. When Margaret finished, she bowed her head. "I can't undo it," she whispered. "But I am sorry. And I want to help, if you'll let me." Somehow. For a long moment, no one moved. Then Charlotte, her throat aching, reached slowly into her pocket and pulled out the battered letter from her mother she always carried. She held it out, her hand shaking slightly. Margaret took it reverently. She read the flowing script that spoke of love, trust, and the bond between Charlotte and the dogs. A bond stronger than grief, stronger than fear. Tears slid down Margaret's lined cheeks. "I don't deserve your forgiveness," she choked. Charlotte said nothing. But after a long moment, she reached out and gently touched Margaret's hand. It wasn't forgiveness. Not yet. But it was a beginning. Walter cleared his throat. "If you really mean to help," he said roughly, "there's a way." And so, Margaret became part of something she never expected. Quietly, behind the scenes, she began funding Charlotte's therapy sessions, paying for advanced training classes for the dogs. She pulled strings with old contacts to secure service animal certification waivers, allowing Charlotte more freedom to walk her dogs safely. She did it anonymously at first. But Veilwood is a small town. Soon people knew. And for once, Margaret didn't care about the whispers. What mattered was Charlotte. And the slow, painful mending of a heart too long broken. As summer bloomed over Veilwood, bringing golden mornings and salt-sweet breezes, a new spirit took hold. Charlotte continued to walk the dogs, now with small groups of curious children occasionally tagging along, learning from her hand signals and silent commands. The townsfolk, once so wary, now waved from their porches. Some left bowls of water by their gates. Others stopped to offer treats or quiet words of encouragement. At the library's summer reading kickoff, Charlotte even stood in front of a small audience, heart hammering, palms sweating, and with Daisy lying calmly at her feet, whispered a few lines about how dogs had saved her life. The applause that followed felt like a soft tide washing away the last jagged edges of her fear. And through it all, Margaret Glenn watched from a respectful distance, older, humbler, but a little lighter in her step. The town that had once seen only danger had learned to see devotion. The girl who had once walked in silence now walked in quiet triumph. And the dogs, the magnificent six, still moved at her side like shadows stitched to her soul, guiding her toward a future bright with hope. On the first clear day of June, the town of Veilwood gathered in Central Park for the annual Local Heroes celebration, a tradition that usually honored firefighters, veterans, or community volunteers. This year, for the first time, the invitation had been extended to someone very different, a quiet 8-year-old girl and her extraordinary dogs. Banners fluttered gently in the ocean breeze as families spread picnic blankets across the grass. A wooden stage had been set up near the bandstand, decorated with simple blue and white streamers. It wasn't a grand ceremony. It wasn't supposed to be. But for Charlotte Hayes, it felt like standing at the summit of a mountain she'd been climbing forever. Walter and June sat proudly in the front row, Walter's cane propped between his knees. Elias Thompson stood nearby, a proud smile creasing his weathered face. And at Charlotte's side, forming a solemn, perfect ring of loyalty, sat Vega, Ranger, Atlas, Fleur, Daisy and Kona, her guardians, her family, her heart. Mayor Angela Beck approached the microphone, clearing her throat as the murmuring crowd fell into an expectant hush. "Today," she began, her voice rich with emotion, "we recognize bravery not born of strength but of love. Resilience not forged in fire but in quiet, everyday courage. And a bond between a girl and her dogs that has taught us more about loyalty, patience and community than any ordinance or law ever could." Applause rippled through the gathering. Charlotte stood trembling beside her dogs, her hands fidgeting with the hem of her simple blue dress. For a terrifying moment she thought she might run. Her selective mutism always tightened its cruel grip when eyes were on her. But then she felt a warm nudge against her leg, Vega's muzzle, steady and sure. Charlotte glanced down, locking eyes with the dog who had been her constant shadow through every nightmare and lonely dawn. She took a breath. And then another. The mayor beckoned her forward. Charlotte moved stiffly onto the stage, Daisy and Ranger at her heels. A small plaque was placed in her hands, but it wasn't the award that mattered. It was the sea of smiling faces before her. Carmen Patterson waving with flowers still dusting her apron. Officer Grant standing tall, nodding with quiet encouragement. Even Margaret Glenn standing at the back under a weeping willow, her face shining with tears. Mayor Beck leaned in gently, offering Charlotte the microphone. "Would you like to say a few words, Charlotte?" The microphone loomed like a monster. For a long, stretching moment, Charlotte could only stare at it. Then, in a voice so soft it seemed woven from mist, she whispered, "Thank you. For letting me keep my family." It wasn't much. Just 8 words. But to the crowd gathered there it was everything. The applause that followed wasn't wild or raucous. It was steady, heartfelt, healing. Later, after the ceremony dissolved into laughter and picnic games, Charlotte found herself sitting beneath the old oak tree with her dogs sprawled around her. Children came to pet them. Parents came to thank her. Margaret approached carefully, not intruding but offering a tentative smile. Charlotte met her gaze. She didn't wave. She didn't speak. She simply placed her hand gently on Ranger's head, and with that small gesture, forgiveness bloomed quietly between them. Fragile, imperfect, but real. The days that followed brought more change, but gentler this time. Margaret anonymously sponsored a fund in Adam and Marina Hayes' names, providing scholarships for service dog training for children with trauma. Charlotte's therapy sessions expanded into a small group where other children learned trust and resilience alongside specially trained dogs. Tourists, having heard the story through local news and whispered tales, began visiting Veilwood just to catch a glimpse of the miracle girl and her pack. Some mornings, Charlotte would see strangers holding coffee cups, standing quietly at a distance, smiles on their faces as they watched her cross the misty streets. And slowly Veilwood itself transformed. Where there had once been suspicion, there grew admiration. Where there had been fear, there sprouted pride. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the crooked rooftops and painted the harbor in molten gold, Charlotte sat with her grandparents on the porch. Fleur rested her heavy head in Charlotte's lap, sighing contentedly. Walter spoke, his voice a low rumble. "Your mom and dad would be so proud of you, sweetheart." Charlotte didn't answer with words. She only smiled, small, shy and real. She had come through the fire. She had held fast to the things that mattered when everything else fell away. And in doing so, she hadn't just kept her family. She had built a new one. Veilwood wasn't perfect. Life wasn't perfect. Grief and memory would always be part of Charlotte's story. But now, woven through the sorrow was something stronger. Hope. Under the wide, starlit sky, Charlotte closed her eyes and whispered a silent promise to the parents she had loved and lost. "I'm okay. We're okay." The 6 German shepherds shifted closer around her, a living shield against the night. And together they faced the future. Unbreakable, unafraid, and utterly, completely free. Charlotte's story reminds us that real strength doesn't always roar. Sometimes, it walks quietly beside you on 4 loyal paws. Even in the face of loss, fear, and judgment, hope finds a way to heal the deepest wounds. Thank you for watching. If Charlotte's journey moved you, don't forget to like, comment your thoughts below, share this video to inspire others, and subscribe to True Echo for more powerful real-life stories that will stay with you long after the screen fades.